Well, this is the second week of a prisoner hunger strike that's taking place right now in California. Some fear it may lead to deaths. Thousands of prisoners across the state have joined together in a protest that began in the security housing unit at the Pelican Bay State Prison. But the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation is now admitting that over 6,000 inmates across the state are refusing meals. And it's become the largest hunger strike in over 10 years to hit the troubled California prison system. Now, the SHU in Pelican Bay Prison is one of the oldest and largest isolation units in the country, with over 1,000 prisoners in isolation. And they say that it's designed to monitor, control, and isolate only the most dangerous of prisoners. But striking prisoners are trying to draw attention to and to peacefully protest what they call 25 years of torture via the CDCR's arbitrary, illegal, and progressively punitive practices. Now, some of the demands include an end to long-term solitary confinement and adequate and nutritious food. Some striking prisoners say that they feel no meaningful change will come until prisoners start dying. So will the state let it go that far? And if they do, what does that say about our prison system? Joining me from our studio in Los Angeles is Clyde Young, revolutionary communist and former prisoner. Clyde, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Now, for starters, do you have any updates for us as to the latest and whether any negotiations are going on in this prison strike?
Well, thank you for having me on, first of all. The latest report that I've received is that there have been negotiations, and perhaps those negotiations are going on today as well, but that they started yesterday between the leaders of the strike inside Pelican Bay and also their mediators on the outside. But no substantial progress has been made in those negotiations. And I'd like to say that it's outrageous that the prison authorities have allowed this situation to progress as far as it has, where the prisoner's health is in serious jeopardy without, giving serious considerations to the demands that they've raised, which are just and legitimate.
Well, yeah, you mentioned that, Clyde. Some of these demands are, they include things like adequate food, access to natural light, warmer clothing, and one phone call a month. Those sound like basic, just demands, and yet up until this point, the CDRC wasn't even willing to negotiate. I just can't understand why they would pretend or why they would act like those demands are really radical.
Yes. Well, I think it shows you something, it tells you something about the callous nature of the prison authorities these days. I was in prison myself 8 years ago, and I served time in isolation for months, but never years and decades. And one of the most poignant things that was said in a letter from a prisoner recently was that prisoners who are incarcerated in Pelican Bay and in Pelican Bay, I should say, actually do not see the sun for decades. And another thing, just for your viewing audience to understand the nature of the problem, they don't hear music for decades. Just imagine being in a situation where you will hear music no more.
Well, Clyde, could you tell us about your personal situation? Like you said, again, you were in solitary confinement for a time. A lot of international organizations would say that that's something that amounts to torture. Would you describe it that way?
I would absolutely describe it that way. If you look at the conditions, and I'd like to focus on the conditions that tens of thousands of prisoners are facing today. Their estimates are up to as high as 100,000 prisoners are confined in isolation cells. And at Pelican Bay, what I understand is that prisoners are in a cell no larger than a small bathroom. They have a concrete slab protruding from the wall, which is their bed, and they have a sink and a toilet. And it's a soundproof room. And I should say it's a soundproof, what prisoners have described as a tomb. And they're confined there for 22.5 hours a day. And whenever they leave their cells, they have to be handcuffed and cavity searched. This is nothing less than torture to confine human beings under these circumstances. And I think there's absolutely no justification for it at all.
Well, the thing is that the California prison system will try to tell you that they place people in isolation that are only the most dangerous of criminals, that they do this in order to break up the gang violence within Californian prisons as well. But has any of that actually stopped? Isn't gang violence inside prisons worse than it ever has been?
Well, I don't exactly, and I don't want to speak to the claims that the prison authorities have made, but what I will say is this, there's absolutely no justification for confining any human being in the kind of circumstances that I've described. Not only the cells that I've described, where they're confined for 22.5 hours a day, but oftentimes they're denied of reading material, and they're also prevented from having materials like colored pencils so that they can draw, and they hear no music. I mean, just think of yourself if you were confined to a small space for 10, 20, 30 years and have no access to music or anything like that. This is just torture. There's absolutely no justification for it, either inside the borders of the U.S. or outside the borders of the U.S.
Now, why do you think that we don't hear more of an uproar about this? Is it because so many Americans don't realize how many people are sitting in solitary confinement and suffering within the U.S., or is it because we have this tough on crime attitude where you say that these people deserve that treatment? They're criminals, lock them up and treat them however you see fit?
Let me answer that question in two ways. I think that, yes, there is an attitude and a climate in the country of being tough on crime. But one of the reasons why so many people are incarcerated in prison, period, to begin with, you have 2.3 million people incarcerated in prisons. This has everything to do with the fact that the upsurge in the 1960s didn't go all the way to a revolution. And here you see what is a repressive steps that have been taken by the system to actually say that something like that will never happen again in this country. And it was people like the ones that are confined at Pelican Bay and all across this country, not only in solitary confinement units, but also in prisons, black and Latinos, and overwhelming majority of them are black and Latinos. People should read Michelle Alexander's book called The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness, to get more details on this particular situation of the mass incarceration, the racially targeted mass incarceration of people across this land.
Now, Clyde, lastly, like I said, so this has been going on for more than 2 weeks now. Apparently, some of these prisoners reportedly are in horrible health. Some are saying that they're willing to die for this cause. Do you think that if there were some fatalities here, that would change the system at all?
Well, I think, first of all, I think the prisoners have said that they're willing to die, but they don't want to. The demands that they have raised are completely just and legitimate demands. They're not outrageous demands. You have articulated what some of them are. They've also said the end to long-term solitary confinement, and also the end to the practice of what the prison officials call gang validation, where someone, on the word of another prisoner or on the word of a guard with absolutely no evidence whatsoever, can be labeled as a gang member and confined in Pelican Bay in the security units. So I think this is just completely outrageous. The second thing I want to say is that the health of many of the prisoners are it's a grave situation in terms of their health. They're deteriorating. And I think it really requires for the public, and the public has actually been duped. It's important to say that, that the public has been duped in this situation. These prisoners have been labeled, they've been demonized, they've been incarcerated on a massive scale, and people have the impression that basically what we're dealing with in terms of the people behind the walls is that they're animals, but they're not animals.
Yeah. Clyde, I'm so sorry. I have to interrupt you because we have to take a break. But I want to thank you very much for joining us, and we'll continue to cover this story. Thank you.
Thank you very much, too.